In the year 1885, when the hills of Virginia lay cloaked in the restless fog of an early spring, when the mountain winds carried the cries of hollowed-out farms and the rattle of cartwheels on half-broken roads, there came a group of women dressed in black habits, their faces pale as moonlight, their eyes deep with a devotion that seemed less to Christ and more to some private covenant of silence. These were the Sisters of Mercy. Though in the scattered townships their name was whispered in ways that carried both awe and dread, for while they were known as healers who arrived wherever sickness struck, they always left behind more graves than those who had fallen ill in the first place, and yet no one dared to turn them away, for in those lonely valleys plagued with typhoid, cholera, and the secret fevers of the mines, a healer was salvation even if her touch was edged with death. Thus it was that in the village of Black Hollow, where the iron works had collapsed the year before and left the air thick with dust and the rivers streaked with coppery blood from the hills, the sisters came in the night, carrying with them a wagon of tinctures, books bound in cracked leather, jars that rattled with roots and powders no one recognized, and a crucifix so tarnished it seemed almost black. They set themselves in the abandoned seminary that overlooked the valley, a building whose windows had long since lost their glass, whose stones sweated with mildew, and yet, when they entered, they lit candles that seemed never to burn down, and the people, desperate for aid, went to them with children burning with fever, with miners coughing up clots of red, with mothers whose skin broke out in rashes like maps of rivers, and the sisters, always calm, always gentle, laid their hands upon them, whispered prayers in a Latin that felt strangely broken, and administered powders and liquids that made the sick groan in either pain or release. Some survived and staggered back home, praising the sisters as God's instruments, but many more never returned, and the sound of the bells that the nuns rang at each passing became as common as the morning cock's crow, until, within a single season, more than 50 graves were dug into the hill behind the seminary, each marked with a wooden cross hammered into the earth by the sisters themselves, who sang low hymns, as if each burial were part of a larger ritual. And, though fear gnawed at the hearts of the townsfolk, they still brought their sick, for who else was there in those ridges where doctors rarely came, and where men died quicker than crops could grow? And so, by summer, the Sisters of Mercy were no longer regarded with unshaken faith, but with uneasy reverence, a reverence laced with the kind of fear one feels before lightning, useful in the storm, but deadly if one stands too near. And the whispers began, that their cures were not cures at all but exchanges, that each life saved required another taken, that they spoke in the dead of night to the graves themselves, kneeling in the fog and pressing their pale faces close to the earth as though listening for replies. Yet even the skeptics, the farmers with their calloused hands, the miners with their cracked fingernails, the widows clutching their last coins, still went to the sisters. For to die at home unaided was a lonelier terror than to die in their care, surrounded by the sound of hymns, and in this way the sisters' dominion grew, until Black Hollow became known not for its mines nor its fields, but for the graves behind the seminary. Graves that rose row upon row like a harvest sown not by God but by something darker. And the townsfolk, though unsettled, began to measure time, not in years or seasons, but in burials, saying, "There have been 73 graves since, the spring, or another 20 since harvest," until numbers themselves seemed to hold a curse. For with each tally came the suspicion that no matter how many were interred, the sisters had some hidden ledger that demanded more, and when children asked their parents why the sisters never aged, why their faces remained unlined though the seasons passed, why their hands never trembled even when they stitched wounds by candlelight at 3 a.m, the parents hushed them quickly, saying such questions would draw bad luck. But in the nights when the fog rolled down and the bells tolled again, those same parents stared from their windows at the seminary on the hill, its single candle-lit window glowing like a watchful eye. And they wondered if the mercy they had welcomed was in truth something else entirely, something that healed with one hand and harvested with the other. And though none dared to say it aloud, a dark conviction grew in Black Hollow, that the Sisters of Mercy, with their prayers and their graves, had not come merely to heal, but to bind the valley to their own secret covenant. One that would, before many years passed, leave behind not 50 nor 100, but 300 graves, each one a testament not to healing, but to the enigma of women whose mercy always seemed to end in death. It was in the winter of 1886, with frost clinging to the blackened fences of Shenandoah County, and silence weighing heavy upon the orchards stripped bare of fruit, that whispers of the Sisters of Mercy's hidden sanctuary began to leak into tavern talk and church pew gossip, and though the sisters had buried dozens by then, the villagers still held to their belief that these women were healers, guardians, and perhaps even saints in fleshly form. For who else but holy hands could ease fever, drain infection, and whisper away the black cough that plagued so many? Yet beneath their chapel, a modest stone structure veined with moss and framed by wild ivy, there were rooms never shown to parishioners or grieving families, rooms where the smell of smoke and iron lingered, where books written in Latin, Greek, and stranger tongues lay chained to desks, where jars of powders, tinctures, dried organs, and pressed herbs lined shelves in careful order, where symbols scorched into the stone floor appeared to serve some forgotten ritual that none outside their cloister could name. And it was here, in the subterranean chambers, that the Sisters of Mercy convened each midnight to record the names of the fallen, not in parish registries nor in the county courthouse, but in their own black-bound ledgers that bore neither cross nor holy crest. Only a faint sigil, like a circle split into thirds, a mark that reappeared on the carved lids of the coffins lowered into earth. The villagers who came to them rarely questioned why so many patients never returned, for the sisters offered consolation with solemn eyes, claiming that the Lord had called his children home, and assuring families that the departed had been eased in their final hours with gentle prayer and herbal draughts that soothed the agony of parting. Yet the truth, if truth it was, seemed more dreadful. Patients did not always die of their afflictions, but sometimes after them, when strength returned, when fever broke, when laughter even returned to lips that had been dry with thirst. For the sisters believed that healing came not in clinging to life, but in delivering the soul past the fragile cage of flesh, a doctrine they did not preach aloud, but held within like scripture written in marrow. Those who ventured close to the chapel after sundown reported muffled chants rising from beneath the floorboards, a drone of voices unbroken by pause for breath, and on certain nights a red glow seemed to bleed from the narrow slits of the cellar windows, staining the snow with ember-like light. In January of that year, a farmer named Elijah Greaves, whose wife had perished under their care, confessed in ale-soaked misery that he had seen her hair, bright as wheat in sunshine, hanging from a nail in the sisters' washroom when he delivered hay for their livestock. And though townsfolk laughed, there lingered in their laughter a tremor, as though each feared the story might contain more substance than drunken sorrow. Others noticed the strange procession of wagons late at night, covered in tarps that sagged under heavy loads, rumbling toward the old cemetery hill where earth was forever damp, where graves appeared in rows like soldiers fallen in silent formation. And though 300 markers would stand there before the decade closed, no priest had ever spoken the rites. No county man had ever signed a death roll. No family had ever been shown the body to confirm its rest. And so it was that the Sisters of Mercy, in their black hoods and pale faces, wrote history in secret. Their legacy carved not in holy relics, but in unblessed tombs. It is said that beneath their chapel they kept one chamber colder than the rest, where bodies lingered long before burial, not to preserve but to prepare. For etched upon each corpse were cuts made with precision, as if following invisible maps of veins and nerves, and certain bones were missing, replaced with waxen replicas sculpted by the sisters' own hands, as though they harvested pieces not for wickedness but for study, as though their healing arts demanded a cost far greater than prayer. A midwife once brought them an infant pale with pneumonia, and when the child died before dawn, the sisters swaddled it not in cloth, but in parchment stitched with thread, each sheet scrawled with writing no one could read, and the midwife swore she heard a voice, neither infant nor nun, whisper from the bundle. As they lowered it into a wooden boy, she fled that night and never returned to the county. Still, the people came, drawn by desperation, by fear of death greater than fear of rumor, and the sisters smiled with soft lips, with voices sweet as psalms, offering comfort while behind their eyes a hidden fire smoldered. One priest, Father Mallory of the Lutheran parish, confronted them, demanding entry to their hidden chambers, and though they bowed to him with humility, they denied his request, claiming that their sanctuary was consecrated ground where no man might tread. Within a fortnight, Father Mallory succumbed to a sudden illness, his body swollen with a fever no tonic relieved, and he was buried swiftly, by the sisters' own hands. So spread the whispers that the healers of Virginia, draped in mercy, draped in piety, were not servants of heaven, but of something older, something that thrived on the exchange of breath for silence, of blood for knowledge, of life for order, and though no one dared voice it too loudly, the 300 graves bore mute testimony. Each mound of earth a sermon in soil, each unblessed coffin, a warning unheeded, until the day would come when the hidden chapel of ashes revealed itself not by the sisters' choice, but by the intrusion of fate. A fate that would burn through Virginia like wildfire through dry fields, leaving behind only the question, were they ever healers at all? Or had their mercy been nothing but a mask for sacrifice? By the time the year turned to its last cold season of 1885, the convent of the Sisters of Mercy stood as both a beacon of healing and a tombstone of unanswered questions, its halls echoing not just with prayers, but with whispers of dread that seemed to weave themselves into the very timbers of its construction. And as the frosted winds swept across the graveyard behind the chapel, where nearly 300 graves now lay in rows too neat, too plentiful for comfort, the villagers could no longer ignore that the ground itself seemed to drink in the dead at a pace no ordinary epidemic could explain. Yet the sisters remained vigilant in their duties, continuing to administer their tinctures, poultices, and whispered blessings, insisting that each death was a sacrifice made in God's inscrutable will. And though their words carried the weight of conviction, the families who lowered their kin into the earth carried only doubt, grief, and the heavy sense that something greater and darker than sickness alone prowled within the convent's walls. The rumors hardened into accusations, with townsfolk claiming to see candlelit processions at ungodly hours. Sisters moving through the graveyard, chanting in Latin not of healing, but of invocation, their pale faces glinting under the moon, as if lit from within by a fire, not divine, but infernal. And in taverns men swore they heard children's cries muffled from the convent, though none had been admitted within its walls for months, while widows recounted dreams where their departed husbands stood at the end of their beds, mouths sewn shut, hands clasped in the prayer posture of the dead, pointing back toward the hill where the convent loomed. Yet still no one dared to intervene, for who could bring themselves to accuse women consecrated to mercy, and who among them could forget that many had once been healed by those very same sisters, their fevers broken, their wounds bound, their children carried through nights of illness only to wake whole again by morning. Such was the paradox that paralyzed the town. The dread that the women they trusted most were perhaps the same ones binding them in a pact of death until December, when the snowfall deepened and the last great incident occurred. For on the feast of St. Agnes a storm rose so suddenly that it seemed less a meteorological accident than a conjuring. Thunder rolling over the hills like drums of war, while lightning revealed the convent's stained-glass windows glowing as though lit from fires within. And the villagers, terrified, sleepless, saw the sisters emerge in procession, 40 of them in dark habits holding lanterns, carrying not the Book of Hours but coffins, small, child-sized, which they lowered into the ground, though no one in the village recalled any children lost that week. It was this act, more than the growing graveyard, more than the unanswered prayers, that broke the town's silence, and in a fever of terror they gathered in secret the following dawn, pledging to confront the sisters. But when they reached the convent gates they found the doors wide open, the chapel candles still burning, but the halls inside were empty, beds neatly made, prayer books aligned, pots still simmering faintly with medicinal broth, as though the sisters had vanished mid-ritual, leaving behind not a trace save for the silence so deep it rang in the ears like a bell. They scoured the convent for hours, climbing to the belfry, descending into the root cellars, and always the same. Emptiness, abandonment, absence, as if the sisters had dissolved into the air or stepped sideways into a place unseen. And when the villagers turned at last to the graveyard, they found that the fresh graves dug the night before were open, their coffins exposed but filled not with bodies but with dirt, packed tight in the shape of human forms, soil sewn together with rosary beads as if mocking the living with effigies of the dead. And from that day forward the convent was abandoned, its bells never rung again, its doors sealed by ivy and time, though the graveyard behind it remained, a testament too massive to be denied. 300 names inscribed in town ledgers, but nowhere to be found in the world beyond. 300 lives snuffed out under the care of women whose faces were remembered not with hatred, but with the ache of betrayal. And so the legend of the Sisters of Mercy hardened into history. their story retold in hushed tones that blurred the line between fact and nightmare. Were they healers who bore the unbearable cost of mercy, each cure demanding a death? Or were they quiet conjurers cloaked in devotion, drawing power from the graves of those who trusted them most, binding the town in a cove, Nantes sealed by soil? No chronicle would answer. No priest could cleanse the memory. No historian would reconcile the contradiction. And so the graves remain to this day, some marked by crumbling heads, stones, others swallowed by moss and time, yet all radiating the same silence that once filled the convent's halls. A silence that seems to grow heavier as night falls, as if the sisters still walk in their hidden procession, lanterns bobbing faintly between the trees, searching not for forgiveness, but for the next name to etch upon their invisible ledger. And though the convent rots in ruin, windows shattered, beams sagging, there are those who swear that on certain winter nights the chapel fills with the sound of chanting, soft, sorrowful, endless, while the snow outside buries the graves anew, hiding them for another season until spring uncovers the count of the dead once more, leaving behind the eternal, chilling question that no villager ever dared to put into words. Did the Sisters of Mercy heal, or did they harvest?